Over 1 in every 3 cars sold in the United States is Japanese. So when tariffs hit, did Japan back down or strike back? Without a single headline-grabbing move, Japan quietly outmaneuvered U.S. trade pressure through strategy, speed, and scale. How did Toyota and Honda keep dominating despite new barriers? What role did Japan's government play in this silent counterstrike? And is the U.S. auto industry now facing a long-term competitive crisis? Let's get into details. The headlines came fast and loud. The United States had just reimposed steep tariffs on vehicles imported from Mexico and Canada, and the ripple effect was immediate. But beneath that decision, one key fact was missed by many in Washington. Many of the cars being targeted weren't American at all, they were Japanese. And this wasn't just a side effect of a broader trade measure. This was a direct hit on one of Japan's most strategic exports, automobiles. For decades, Japanese carmakers like Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda have heavily invested in North American assembly plants, particularly in Mexico. They did this not to bypass American laws, but to operate closer to one of their largest markets, reduce costs, and meet local demand more efficiently. Now, these same investments were being punished. The tariffs, pushed under renewed Trump campaign pressure and echoed by economic nationalists, aimed to restore manufacturing in the United States, but at a serious cost. According to the CNBC report published on 19 March 2025, the tariffs placed on vehicles assembled outside of the United States immediately affected Japanese automakers' supply chains. Toyota, for instance, had several major manufacturing sites in Mexico, producing some of its most popular models sold in the United States. Similarly, Honda's factories in Ontario, Canada, and in Mexico were crucial for their North American operations. These were not just export plants, they were a core part of the global value network. The sudden imposition of tariffs forced executives in Tokyo to reassess their operational balance. Within hours, the stock prices of Toyota and Honda dropped slightly in Tokyo trading, and automotive suppliers with deep ties to Mexico, like Denso and Aisin, began issuing cautious investor guidance. Behind closed doors, major Japanese automotive boards convened emergency strategy sessions. But the impact wasn't just financial. The tariffs sent a clear message to Japan. Washington was now willing to weaponize trade policy in ways that blurred the line between domestic politics and international cooperation. What concerned Tokyo even more was the ambiguity of the United States messaging. There was no warning, no negotiation, and no exception offered to countries that had long considered themselves close allies. For Japanese carmakers, this was less about money and more about trust. And in business, especially at this level, trust is everything. Despite their initial public restraint, the reaction from automakers quickly began to take shape. Toyota issued a measured statement expressing disappointment in the lack of dialogue before the tariffs were enacted, while Nissan warned that costs could rise for consumers if the policy continued. Honda, in a rare political comment, noted that these moves undermined years of cross-border cooperation in innovation and investment. But these weren't just statements for public consumption. They were opening shots in what would soon become a much broader counter-strategy. Japanese automakers did not waste time retaliating. Instead of engaging in a war of words, they turned their attention inward to their research labs, global logistics networks, and design floors. The primary goal was clear. If Washington wanted to make imports difficult, Tokyo would make their exports indispensable. Within weeks of the tariff announcement, Toyota fast-tracked plans for a new hybrid engine line set to be manufactured in Japan and exported globally. Honda initiated a shift in its global production schedule, reducing volumes in Mexico and Canada while expanding facilities in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand. Nissan doubled down on its strategy to make battery-powered compact cars affordable to middle-income American buyers, delivering models that U.S. automakers were struggling to match in both price and efficiency. Crucially, these moves weren't haphazard. Japan had anticipated something like this. Since 2018, during the first Trump presidency, there had been hints that trade protectionism could return. That warning had already pushed Japanese firms to explore alternative production hubs, diversify supply chains, and invest more in digital automation at home. Now, they simply accelerated those plans. Meanwhile, the Japanese government closely monitored the developments. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry began quiet consultations with major carmakers, assessing the scope of impact and potential countermeasures. The mood in Tokyo was measured but firm. This wasn't the first time Japan had faced pressure from the United States over trade. But this time, the stakes were different. The global auto industry was transforming fast. Electric vehicles were no longer a futuristic concept, they were the battleground. And Japan, already several steps ahead in hybrid and battery technology, saw an opportunity to take control. The Azer News report added another dimension to the picture. According to their coverage, Japanese companies responded to trade friction by redirecting capital toward energy-efficient and sustainable transport systems. This wasn't just greenwashing. Toyota had been working on solid-state battery research for years. Nissan's commitment to an all-electric lineup in the next decade was on track, and Honda had recently partnered with General Motors to share battery development, although those talks began to lose momentum amid rising political tension. What became clear in those first few weeks after the tariffs was that Japan was not planning to back down. Instead of engaging in rhetorical retaliation, its strategy was to outperform. Their EV models were more efficient, their hybrids were more affordable, and their supply chains were more agile. While U.S. automakers scrambled to lobby Congress for exemptions or subsidies, Japanese manufacturers leaned into innovation. And they didn't have to work alone. Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia were eager to welcome Japanese automotive investment. These nations offered lower labor costs, friendlier trade terms, and growing domestic markets. As factories in Mexico began adjusting for lower output, factories in Southeast Asia ramped up hiring and procurement. Japan's pivot was swift and calculated. What this meant for the U.S. auto market became clearer as dealerships started reporting delays in certain models. The tariffs had unintentionally triggered disruptions that impacted both imported and domestically assembled Japanese-branded vehicles. Customers were left facing higher prices, longer wait times, or fewer choices. And ironically, American-built cars weren't seeing a proportionate boost in sales. The consumer still wanted reliability, fuel efficiency, and value, all of which Japan had built its reputation on. In Washington, the political calculus grew more complicated. The original intent of the tariffs had been to push automakers back into American territory, creating jobs and boosting domestic manufacturing. But the reality was less clean-cut. The auto supply chain is globally integrated. By punishing Japanese companies with roots in North America, the United States had inadvertently threatened thousands of jobs at local parts suppliers, dealerships, and logistics firms, many of them American. The first signs of blowback came from within the industry. In Michigan, several small suppliers voiced concern about order reductions from Japanese clients. In Texas, where Toyota has one of its major North American headquarters, local officials warned that prolonged trade friction could affect state revenue and employment. And in California, electric vehicle advocates worried that limiting access to affordable hybrid models would delay the broader shift to sustainable transport. All the while, Tokyo remained mostly silent in public. No sweeping statements, no direct rebukes. Instead, it signaled its intentions through production shifts, trade data, and innovation rollouts. Japan wasn't playing to the press. It was playing for position. As the weeks rolled on, the bigger picture came into view. Japan's auto industry was not merely surviving the tariff wave, it was redirecting its momentum. The early signs pointed to a broader strategy already in motion. One not designed just to absorb impact, but to deliver one. But the real response didn't come from a press room or a government podium. It came from the factory floor, the R&D labs, and the global boardrooms of Japan's automotive giants. Quietly but deliberately, Japanese automakers began mobilizing a broad industrial counteroffensive. Their goal wasn't to issue threats. It was to render the tariffs irrelevant. The first visible move came from Nissan, which had been developing a new lineup of compact electric vehicles aimed squarely at the North American middle-class market. With fuel efficiency, low maintenance, and affordability at the heart of their design, these vehicles were intended to compete directly with American electric cars, particularly in urban and suburban areas. Nissan accelerated its launch timeline and redirected some production away from Mexico to facilities in Japan and Southeast Asia. Toyota followed with its own response. The company's long-standing commitment to hybrid technology suddenly took center stage. Engineers who had been working behind the scenes on a new high-efficiency hybrid drivetrain were pulled into emergency planning sessions. Within a month, Toyota confirmed that it would be shifting production of select hybrid models from Mexico to Japan and Thailand. These cars would still make their way to American roads, but under different logistics structures, ones designed to reduce exposure to U.S. trade policy shifts. Honda, meanwhile, began to intensify investment into its domestic facilities and fast-track the development of its next-generation battery electric platform. Part of this strategy involved sourcing more components from non-U.S. suppliers. This wasn't simply to reduce cost, it was a protective measure against political uncertainty. If supply chains were going to be used as weapons, Honda would not leave its operations vulnerable to sudden shocks. But production shifts were only part of the strategy. Marketing teams began recalibrating campaigns to highlight Japan's edge in quality, longevity, and technology. In markets where tariffs were raising sticker prices, the focus moved to long-term value, lower fuel consumption, fewer maintenance issues, and higher resale value. These weren't just talking points. According to automotive reliability rankings, Japanese brands continued to dominate global surveys, outpacing American counterparts in key categories. Then came the pricing response. Instead of raising prices to absorb the tariffs, several Japanese automakers chose to absorb the initial costs themselves. Profit margins took a hit, but market share remained intact. In some cases, special financing packages were introduced in U.S. dealerships to counteract the price increases caused by the tariffs. These offers were not publicized with much fanfare, but they were effective. For buyers, the overall cost difference between a Japanese car and an American competitor remained small, and in some cases, Japanese vehicles were still cheaper over time due to better fuel economy. Back in Tokyo, government advisors and corporate strategists were beginning to see results. The tariffs, which were expected to damage Japan's position in the U.S. auto market, had instead exposed the flexibility and resilience of its companies. By not engaging in a tit-for-tat media war, Japan kept its public image clean while executing an industrial shift that turned obstacles into opportunities. Trade data over the following months showed a subtle but meaningful trend. While exports from Mexican and Canadian plants declined, shipments from Japanese and Southeast Asian factories increased. More importantly, the types of vehicles entering the U.S. were shifting toward electrified models, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and full electric vehicles, areas where Japan held a clear lead in technology and manufacturing efficiency. The Azer News report from March also pointed to a broader shift in energy strategy. Japanese firms were prioritizing sustainability, not just as a marketing tool, but as a way to future-proof their global competitiveness. Investment in hydrogen fuel cell technology, battery recycling, and lightweight materials accelerated across all major car makers. This was not reactive behavior, it was strategic planning. On the consumer side, the impact began to show in dealership data. Sales of Japanese-branded EVs and hybrids remained steady in spite of the tariffs. In some states, particularly California and Washington, Japanese hybrids were still among the top sellers due to local incentives and strong brand loyalty. American automakers, on the other hand, were still catching up. Several of their electric vehicle platforms had faced production delays, software glitches, or cost overruns. While companies like Ford and General Motors had made strides, they were not yet in a position to dominate. At the same time, Japanese companies began quietly lobbying through trade associations and global auto alliances. Their aim was not necessarily to force the U.S. to repeal the tariffs immediately, but to ensure that Japanese innovation and investment would not be sidelined in future trade talks. By working through multilateral forums, they increased diplomatic pressure without the need for open confrontation. Southeast Asian governments also became part of the equation. Thailand's Board of Investment issued statements welcoming Japanese automotive expansion. Vietnam's industrial zones saw increased activity from Japanese suppliers, many of whom were shifting production from North America. Indonesia announced it would offer new incentives to electric vehicle manufacturers, with Japan as its preferred partner. These developments weren't headline-grabbing, but they marked a fundamental reshaping of the global auto manufacturing map. Meanwhile, Japanese firms doubled down on after-sales networks in the U.S. market. Parts distribution, service centers, and local employment remained largely untouched. This meant that even if production volumes from Mexico or Canada decreased, the presence of Japanese automakers in the U.S. remained deeply rooted. For Washington, this complicated the narrative. On one hand, the tariffs were intended to bring jobs and production home. On the other hand, penalizing Japanese firms with large American footprints risked disrupting employment in U.S. towns and cities that depended on these operations. Analysts began warning that the longer the tariffs remained in place, the greater the long-term risk for U.S. automakers. If Japanese firms continued to absorb the costs and push technological advantages, they could expand their dominance in key segments. Compact cars, fuel-efficient sedans, and affordable hybrids, areas where Detroit had already lost ground, were slipping further from reach. The unintended result of the tariffs was now becoming clearer. Japan had not only maintained its share of the U.S. market, it had quietly strengthened it. The production reshuffling had given Japanese automakers even more control over where and how their vehicles were built, with less reliance on any single region. Technological investments had accelerated, making the competition more one-sided than before. And global partnerships, especially in Asia, had gained new relevance. Through all this, one thing remained constant: Japan did not engage in direct retaliation. There were no counter-tariffs, no angry press conferences. Instead, its response was industrial, systemic, and forward-looking. It didn't just protect its position, it set the stage for a longer game, one where flexibility, innovation, and patience could achieve more than confrontation ever could. By the time American policymakers started reviewing the broader economic impacts, Japan had already executed much of its shift. The U.S. tariffs remained in place, but their effectiveness had been blunted. Japan's automakers had simply moved around them. As one industry executive reportedly said in a closed-door briefing, the goal wasn't to fight the fire, it was to make sure the flame never reached the engine. The strategy was working. While the automakers were busy restructuring and adapting on the ground, Japan's central institutions were crafting a broader response, one that stretched beyond assembly lines and supply chains. In Tokyo, the message from policymakers was clear: the country would not stand idle while one of its most important industries came under attack. What followed was not a loud outcry, but a carefully measured strategy rooted in diplomacy, economic leverage, and global alignment. The Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry held a series of closed-door meetings with senior executives from Japan's top automotive firms. These weren't symbolic sessions for media optics. They were working groups designed to coordinate industrial responses with national interests. Discussions reportedly focused on how Japan could safeguard long-term access to overseas markets, reduce exposure to policy shocks from the United States, and strengthen regional integration across Asia. Within days, policymakers began hinting at broader financial consequences. Though it stopped short of any formal retaliation, Japan's Ministry of Finance raised concerns over the reliability of the U.S. as a trade partner. Behind the scenes, analysts noted a quiet shift in Japan's investment strategy. Holdings in U.S. Treasury bonds were reportedly being reviewed. This development did not emerge in isolation. Over the past several years, Tokyo had already been slowly diversifying its foreign reserves, a process that gained urgency in the wake of escalating trade tensions. For Japan, the move was not about punishing the U.S. directly, but about reducing economic dependency on a market whose policies had become less predictable. In public, the Japanese government maintained a cautious tone. Officials stated that they valued their partnership with the United States, but emphasized the need for balanced trade practices. The Foreign Ministry issued a diplomatic communication expressing concern over the tariffs' impact on bilateral economic stability. Meanwhile, Japan's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization began gathering support to raise the issue within multilateral trade frameworks. There was no ultimatum, no dramatic posturing, just a clear signal that Japan was taking the matter seriously and preparing a range of economic counterbalances. At the same time, Japan intensified efforts to deepen ties with other global partners. Trade discussions with the European Union were accelerated. Southeast Asian nations, already home to significant Japanese automotive investment, began talks to expand regional cooperation on electric vehicle supply chains. Thailand and Vietnam, in particular, expressed interest in new manufacturing partnerships that would allow Japan to reroute exports previously destined for the United States. Japan was not retreating. It was repositioning. The focus on the electric vehicle sector remained central. By 2025, Japanese companies had already established themselves as global leaders in hybrid and fuel-efficient vehicle technologies. Now, with U.S. tariffs threatening market access, these firms saw new value in aligning their product strategies with governments outside North America. In Europe, where emission regulations were tightening, Japan's advanced hybrid systems offered a clear advantage. In developing markets, low-cost plug-in hybrids presented a practical bridge to full electrification. By offering scalable technology solutions, Japanese manufacturers were increasing their relevance in regions that were shaping the next wave of auto demand. On the financial front, Tokyo's policymakers began using subtle signals to influence global perception. A minor reduction in U.S. bond purchases raised eyebrows in currency markets. Statements by Japanese financial officials stressing the importance of a diversified reserve policy were widely interpreted as a sign of declining confidence in the dollar. None of this amounted to direct confrontation, but in the financial world, even small signals carry weight. Japanese banks and investment funds were also advised to consider the geopolitical risks of overexposure to North American markets. The government did not issue mandatory restrictions, but the tone of official communications made clear that a realignment was underway. Meanwhile, Japan's central bank maintained a stable domestic policy, ensuring that the yen remained competitive in export markets without triggering retaliatory accusations of currency manipulation. At the industry level, coordination between corporate and government strategies became increasingly evident. Toyota and Nissan were not acting in isolation. Their decisions to shift production, diversify supply chains, and absorb short-term tariff costs were being supported by institutional backing. Tax incentives, research grants, and international trade dialogues all aligned to create a framework in which the auto sector could adapt quickly and decisively. This was the Japanese model at work: quiet, coordinated, and effective. Instead of escalating the conflict, Tokyo used its diplomatic channels, financial tools, and industrial networks to reduce long-term vulnerability. The impact of this strategy was already being felt. In Washington, the tone began to shift. Early confidence that the tariffs would pressure automakers into reshoring production began to give way to concern about unintended consequences. As Japanese automakers continued to perform well in the U.S. market, and as regional production ramped up in Asia, American analysts started to question the efficacy of the policy. More importantly, questions emerged about Japan's willingness to remain economically dependent on a partner it could no longer predict. Trade groups in the United States raised alarm over the potential for supply chain disruptions and rising consumer prices. Some lawmakers, especially in states with large Japanese auto operations, called for a review of the tariffs. But with campaign season in full swing, few were willing to publicly challenge the policy's broader political narrative. Meanwhile, the Japanese public largely supported their government's approach. Opinion polling showed strong backing for measures that prioritize national industry resilience and long-term competitiveness. Media coverage highlighted the contrast between U.S. political volatility and Japan's stable, measured response. In Japanese boardrooms, the sentiment was clear. The country had not been caught off guard. It had been preparing for this. By mid-year, early trade data began to confirm the effectiveness of Japan's repositioning. Although exports from Mexico and Canada had declined, overall exports to the United States remained surprisingly stable, buoyed by direct shipments from Japan and Southeast Asia. Domestic production had absorbed much of the shock, and Japanese firms were gaining ground in other international markets. The auto industry, far from being crippled, had proven its ability to adapt and possibly even strengthen in the face of protectionist pressure. But Tokyo's strategy wasn't just about endurance. It was also about leverage. Quietly, Japanese officials began suggesting that unless the tariffs were lifted, future cooperation on trade and innovation could be affected. These remarks, made in diplomatic circles and trade forums, did not carry immediate threats, but they did carry weight. In a global economy increasingly driven by complex partnerships and technical collaboration, Japan was signaling that it held more cards than Washington may have assumed. The counter strategy had moved from adaptation to influence. Japan was no longer only reacting to the tariffs, it was shaping the broader economic environment in which those tariffs existed. And it was doing so without drama, without provocation, and without violating the rules of international trade. As Japan's counter strategy unfolded, the effects began to land where it hurt most, within the heart of the United States auto industry. What had started as a political maneuver aimed at protecting American manufacturing was now showing signs of backfiring. The market reality on the ground told a different story. Japanese automakers, by adapting quickly and efficiently, had not only preserved their market share in the United States, they had grown more competitive. Industry data showed that Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda collectively continued to account for more than 35% of all passenger vehicles sold in the United States. Toyota, in particular, remained one of the top-selling brands nationwide. Even with the new tariffs in place, consumers kept buying Japanese cars for one simple reason: they offered more value. Whether it was reliability, fuel efficiency, or total cost of ownership, Japanese vehicles consistently outperformed many of their American counterparts in key segments. The impact rippled through Detroit. U.S. manufacturers, particularly in the small car and hybrid categories, found themselves squeezed. For years, companies like Ford and General Motors had pulled back from producing compact sedans and shifted focus toward trucks and large SUVs. But as fuel prices crept up and environmental regulations tightened, consumer interest in smaller, efficient vehicles returned. Unfortunately for U.S. brands, they no longer had strong offerings in that space. Japanese automakers filled the gap with precision. Suppliers were among the first to feel the pressure. Smaller component manufacturers in the United States who depended on contracts from Toyota and Honda saw some orders rerouted to Asia. Dealership networks were also affected. While showroom traffic remained healthy for Japanese brands, some American dealers struggled to move inventory amid growing competition. The price advantage that tariffs were supposed to create simply didn't materialize at scale. Japanese firms had absorbed costs, kept pricing competitive, and delivered vehicles that matched consumer expectations. Meanwhile, in Washington, there was a growing recognition that the policy had triggered more disruption than revival. Economists pointed out that while the intent was to shield American industry, the result had been to expose structural weaknesses. Japan had not retaliated through politics, but through performance. Their vehicles spoke louder than any diplomatic exchange. And in the streets and driveways of the United States, buyers had made their preference clear. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.